Now, Natasha, we didn't give you a chance to talk more about anger.
No, I started the conversation. That's fine.
Okay.
That's exactly where I would have headed next. And Sydney asks, I've heard anger is a cover-up emotion, and I preferred the word secondary because cover-up almost feels like it's doing like something sneaky or that it shouldn't be doing. I think anger is a legitimate emotion. It's real, all of on its own. And at the same time, it's not usually like you just get angry right away. It's like something is painful, and then anger is one response to that pain. Depression can also be a response to that pain. Lots of things can be a response to that pain, but what's painful? And even if you're not in a mixed faith marriage, this can be really helpful just from an individual perspective. Next time that you're listening to a church talk, or next time you have a friend say something, or when you're triggered, it's kind of like, what about this particular information was painful to me? And do some journaling on that, or do some contemplating, or talk to somebody who kind of gets it from your perspective on those types of things. Those can be useful tools to help you tune into the underlying pain that is, kind of firing up the anger. But yeah, I even love the imagery we have in the scriptures of, Jesus, the perfect one, throwing tables around and being all pissed off and pissy because of this. He had an anger response that had to do with social justice and had to do with, taking care of vulnerable people. And that's a legitimate, appropriate response. So whether you see that as symbolic or literal as a story, there's a lot of power in a perfect being having a response of anger. I love that.
Jenna asks a good question. She asks, if we are stuck in anger, it is because we are not feeling it. So by not feeling it, we are ensuring that it lasts. And that's a question. And I think that's the core issue of the movie that you just mentioned, Natasha. Inside Out.
Inside Out.
In that case, the target emotion was depression, not anger. But this is true with depression, just like it is with anger. Any emotion that you avoid and oppress grows, just like a pot, like a lid held tight on a boiling pot of water. If you keep that lid on tight and the boiling emotion festers, you're going to explode or start to deteriorate with all sorts of physical manifestations of stress, autoimmune diseases, deterioration of your, mental health and well-being with anxiety, etc. It's exactly that irony that by trying not to feel something, by suppressing it, you're going to make it worse, and you're going to ensure that you never heal. How does that sound?
I think that sounds really good. And I think it's sometimes confusing because people are like, well, but I feel like I'm feeling angry all the time. That's why I'm angry. Right? So what do you mean I'm not feeling it? Right? I think a lot of people, there's different ways that people process anger. Some people have like kind of anger that's suppressed, and until they really kind of talk in therapy, like in a therapy or coaching kind of scenario, they don't even realize that anger was kind of there. But a lot of people kind of realize that they're raging, and that they're kind of easily flustered and easily kind of, treating people, especially in their closest circles, oftentimes not very well. And their people are telling them that, like, why are you so angry? And why are you constantly coming at me? And why do I feel like I'm the church that you're constantly beating up on, or things like that. So I think some people are very aware that they're in a state of anger. And yet the work is still leading into what's the pain about, because anger in some ways, although it's very motivational and it can be very healthy, it can also protect you from the deeper pain work. It's easier, especially I think for men and for some women, like even for me, because I'm feisty and I'm all, whatever, it's easier for me to express anger than it is to really break down and show emotion of the painful kind. To cry in front of somebody is much harder for me than to express anger. So I think that there is work that's kind of in conjunction there with, it's not just raging, it's really doing the work about what the anger is about that we're talking about. And that means getting into the pain.
Yeah. And I love how we've talked about anger so far, and this idea of, being able to be reflective on how anger is showing up in us and what it feels like, and what being able to go a little bit deeper and do that work. I also really love and value being able to see anger in those we love and being able to identify, because I think it is an emotion that can feel scary for many of us, especially if you're on the receiving end or you're feeling it from someone you love. And being able, I think, to navigate and hold anger from someone else, and being able to kind of do that pivot where you can hear it, you can hold it, and you pivot to questions that might prompt more vulnerability, to go a little bit deeper. And that's where, just as you were saying, Natasha, that's where the good stuff is. That's where the deep processing is, and that's where the healing is.
We're getting great comments from our listeners. Weston writes, I wish I had known this my whole life. He goes on to write, exercise has been my go-to for pushing the anger back down. And that's important. We use all sorts of forms of self-medication, some of them stereotypically unhealthy, like alcohol or drugs, binge watching of this or that. And then sometimes we can avoid through more healthy coping mechanisms like exercise. But at the end of the day, if you're avoiding dealing with your emotions, it's going to catch up to you in some way or another. And so, Weston, we're really glad you shared that. So lots of people want us to do an entire podcast on anger. So so that's valuable. Debbie, who I think Debbie's a therapist, do you want to read what Debbie writes, Margie?
Can you talk about how to respond to someone who is stuck in right fights, like when the adult child is the exmo and the parent is the member? Like better ways to respond when the other party gets triggered. What is the pain about? Can we get out of ourselves enough to ask that question? And then continuing, Mormon culture shames anger and tears. In the church and out of it, I see it on both sides.
Natasha, do you want to respond to Debbie?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And in some ways, you've given some examples of this. If I'm going to just use two really simple words that are much more simplistic than the process of actually doing this work, which is very hard when you are also usually triggered as well by somebody's reaction to you in a truth fight. But I would say focusing on process and focusing on validation. So validation is a very simple way that you can just kind of repeat what the other person is saying. So what I hear you saying, Mom, is that for you, the church is true and that this doctrine is kind of the way it is and that God would want it this way. You can say something like that without necessarily agreeing with it. Does that make sense?
Or Mom, I can tell that you're scared that this is breaking up our eternal family and that must be really hard for you.
That's process. That's not validation.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense? So, right, exactly that, exactly what you just said. That's a process. Like I'm feeling your defensiveness or your fear, or I think you're worried. It's like you're picking up on their process, right? And so then now all of a sudden you're getting again deeper than the superficial doctrine discussion. It's like, what are you worried about? What are your wishes? What are your hopes? What are your fears? How is my being different in this particular way, in a sense, threatening a lot of your wishes, dreams, hopes, fears types things. So you can validate, you can offer a validation, which is just repeating what they're saying. You can offer a process kind of, like checkup, like it seems to me like you're worried about me, Mom, or it seems to me like you're sad that I don't agree with you on this point, right? Right.
And just this goes back to the primary emotion discussion, but just this exercise of, each of you don't have to talk about content. You don't have to agree. Your job is to listen empathetically to the other person to the point where you could restate back to them what they said and what they were feeling. And if you can show that you understand and care about how they're feeling and that you understand their concern, oftentimes that's all people will really need. I mean, it would be nice if everyone agreed with us and everything we thought and everything we did and vice versa. That's not really maturity. It's not healthy. It's not reality. But so often, if we can stop the fight, call a timeout, do empathetic listening, restate back what we heard the others say, and then more importantly, empathize with the emotions that we heard, that can go a long way to dealing with someone who's really angry. And there's some people who are just angry and they're not going to be able to change and they're too triggered and this is too sensitive. And in those cases, you just have to boundary and say, either we're not going to talk about this as long as you're not in a healthy place to talk about it. That's one way to put up a loving boundary. And another way is just to say, as long as you're in this place of making me feel bad, saying hurtful things, I'm not going to be able to have this close of a relationship with you. And so sometimes boundarying is the only way to deal with anger, depending on the person's openness.
Or another way to boundary is to say, I really can see that this is now creating, some pain between us. And I care so much about this relationship that I really feel like, for now, let's just, move on in a place of love and we won't talk about it. I really love sort of this idea of boundarying for the relationship. You're doing it out of love and out of respect for the relationship and stating that, I love our relationship and value it so much that, we don't need to have these kind of right fight conversations. We can dwell in other places.
I love it.
I think one of our biggest themes here, Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis, is keep it relational, not doctrinal.
Yeah. Yep.
I love it. Thanks, Debbie, for those questions. Debbie writes, beautiful. Thank you. You guys are amazing. So many angles covered. I love healing conversations. Well, thanks, Debbie. We like that you're joining us and everyone else who's joined us as well. We love to have partners in these healing conversations. If any of you want to share this conversation on your wall, your timelines, in groups, in email, if you think this conversation would be helpful to people, share it because we want to get the word out. One last thing about anger, just because it's so heartfelt. Lisa writes an experience she had at church. Natasha, I'm not sure if you've got that in front of you. If you don't, I'll read it.
It starts with 2 weeks ago.
I'll read it.
It doesn't. I don't have.
It's okay.
Mine doesn't scroll.
I'll read it.
fast.
I'll read it. You respond to it. Lisa writes, 2 weeks ago, I went to church with my parents to show them I am willing to attend, even though I don't believe. We were sitting in Relief Society talking about respecting mothers and how to be a good mother, which I have said before, I will never be a mother. As the lesson began, I hear the sunbeam singing, Jesus wants me for a sunbeam. I started thinking how we start so early. Then as the lesson is coming to a close, I hear the primary children singing praise to the man. And anger so harsh surfaced to the point I couldn't hold back the tears from flowing. It was almost a release and understanding I am on my own journey of change and I don't have to hold on to was a life expectation of who I needed to be. Natasha, what do you do when you're flooded like that? It's going to be something that a lot of people just get caught by this unexpected huge wave of anger. What do you recommend people do when they're just flooded at church or in a family at Thanksgiving dinner, in a family conversation? What do you recommend people do when they're just flooded with overwhelming anger?
Well, I would hope that all of us, just as a matter of good mental health practice, would have a nice list of about 20 to 50 things, and I'm not kidding, 20 to 50 things that you can do in a pinch that, would help you self-soothe. Yeah. So anything from like a breathing exercise, if you really kind of can't leave, like maybe you're in a driving car, or something like that, to excusing yourself to go to the bathroom and splashing water on your face, to calling a supportive friend, to journaling, to, 500 ways. And of course, that's going to be unique to every single individual. What's helpful to them, go outside and get some fresh air, go on a little walk. A lot of these things you can do even in a church building, right? You can always go to the bathroom. Nobody's going to fault you for that. You can take a break in that regard. You can sit there and cry and just notice yourself, kind of do a body scan of how it's showing up in your body. Oh, it's interesting that my cheeks feel red and my neck feels constrained and my shoulders feel tense. And so just kind of helping yourself tune into your body language. I think these are all opportunities to learn how to self-soothe, including support networks. It doesn't have to be always by yourself. Like you can call a friend, or you can, ask somebody to watch a comedy with you so you can kind of get your mind off of something, or you can ask somebody to go on a walk with you, or it doesn't have to be alone. It's just a way that you've said, I can do this. I can do this particular thing. There's something though that I want to say just about that space that I also feel like, and just listening to her comment, I still can't read it. It sounds like it was almost empowering for her to go through that flooding moment, like something almost clicked and kind of like, yeah, this is a space where I am no longer feeling health and wellness and edification. And there's something powerful about, again, we don't want to always just soothe our way out of the flooding. We want to have the flooding inform us.
Love it. What were you going to say?
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say. I felt like that comment was such a great example of going deeper to really be able to identify why the anger was showing up. And it was showing up in a way because, she was feeling negated on some level for her decisions and for who she feels at the core she is and what she wants from her life. And that is so, I think, informative and good to know and empowering, as far as kind of moving forward. So I absolutely love that comment. And it also, as you were talking about soothing, Natasha, one of the things I really love for me in the grief process was, coming out of, a number of grief instances in my life where I have had to grieve deeply, is I do feel like it is this opportunity to, like, I've gotten very good at sort of what tools work to soothe. And I love the immediate soothing. So you're in a situation and all of a sudden you're overcome with emotion. But I also love it structurally in your life, amidst a faith transition, amidst the grief of, mourning the loss of someone. This idea of having structural things in our lives. That's what yoga was for me. That's when I started meditating. I started meditating at a time of loss, and really being able to build up this kind of repertoire of healthy coping. And it's something that you will be, you can revisit and add to, but it is something that you can use for a lifetime. It will last a lifetime, and you will always kind of revisit. And it's sort of like a tool belt, if you will, that you can turn to. So I just loved that.
I love it. We've been digging into anger because it's such an important part of this grieving process. Yeah. We should do an entire episode on it. Marcus says, I love the things you do. It's late in Germany. I'm going to bed. Is it possible to get these steps as a PDF? Well, Marcus, we'll be sharing this full episode, multi-part episode on the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis website, on the YouTube page, and on the Facebook Live site. So you can access all this later and listen to it at your leisure. We do hope to work all of this into a book. We're slowly working on that, and your support will help make that happen. So thanks for a reminder, Marcus. We will work towards getting a book out. In the meantime, please check out the podcast. And listeners, the sooner you want to see a book out, please support us. That will help make that happen. All right. So I think we should move on past anger. Is that all right? Natasha, is that all right?
Yes.
There's a lot more to say, but we'll save it for another episode. So we'll talk about bargaining. Bargaining is, seeking in vain for a way out. Now, there's a difference between bargaining and testing. Testing is realistic solutions. Mm-hmm. Bargaining is when you are still in denial, but you're trying to find ways out that of a situation that's unavoidable. So I do think apologetics is a really, common example. So for some, liberal or progressive Mormonism can be a bargaining stage. Now, for other people, it can be an endpoint, because there are people who have found a way, like let's just say Dan Witherspoon or Janice Spangler or others, Thomas McConkie, who will say that they've been doing this for years and have arrived at a place of stasis where they've been able to, go through, let's just say, Fowler's stages of faith and go from stage 3 to stage 4 to stage 5, where they've integrated a new worldview. And this is where Richard Rohr comes in. You can find a way to make religion less literal. It's not about true or false. It's more about good and bad. And it's about a pragmatic utilitarian view instead of a validity approach, where you can just say, I don't look at the scriptures literally anymore. I don't see this as the one true church. I take the good and I leave the bad. I take a buffet approach. For some, that's an endpoint, and that probably comes out of realistic testing. So we'll talk about testing and bargaining together. For others, bargaining, and I would say there are other people that follow the apologetic route. For example, I've talked to many, many, many former members of FAIR or even the Maxwell Institute, who for many, many years, apologetics was their way to avoid the inevitable, which is to try and stretch and flex your beliefs into something that for some ends up being not really Mormonism, but their own little version of Mormonism created in their heads, that for some ends up not working out. And so there are many, many people that follow the stay LDS model that I wrote about. There's a whole manual on how to stay in the church after a crisis of your faith. You can go to staylds.com and find that essay and read it. For some, that was just postponing the inevitable, because they tried to become a buffet Mormon. They tried to become a metaphorical Mormon. They tried to become a liberal Mormon. But in the end, it was just not possible. And so that is one example of bargaining, which is trying to avoid, for what many becomes this inevitable conclusion: the church isn't what I claimed to be, isn't what it claimed to be, it wasn't what I was taught, or the church isn't something that I can be a part of anymore, or the church hurts people and I can't be complicit in the anger. That's where some people end up. But everything before that phase is the bargaining, which is trying to make it, the inevitable, avoidable, trying to make something inescapable escapable. Margie, do you have any thoughts on bargaining?
So I have a question. I'm interested, is there, is the difference between bargaining then and this idea of testing out, that you could be going down the same road, but what would make it bargaining is if it's in vain. It actually doesn't work, right? So in the end, it is too arduous or too psychologically taxing, and it's just not workable. Versus a testing out would be that, you shift and, you're more of a buffet Mormon, or you make accommodations and they end up actually working for you. Is that what I hear you kind of talking about?
It can go either way. And so for some, the liberal progressive route works. For others, the liberal progressive route is what they do before they leave.
Yeah. So the key is whether it actually works for you or not. And the key in bargaining is it does not work.
Yeah.
It is a vain attempt.
And again, for some, apologetics works. It's just like a taper. When the Book of Mormon said horse, it meant taper. When Joseph Smith said he translated the papyra, what he really did is he didn't know what he was doing, and the papyrus was just what inspired him to channel revelation from God. Or, polygamy, was God's Abrahamic test, that he asked these women to do something that was awful and terrible.
Yeah.
But you're poking me.
I know. I'm curious because I want to actually know for you what bargaining looks like practical. What was bargaining for you? How did you bargain? Natasha, did you bargain?
Natasha, did you bargain? Are you bargaining? Or did we lose Natasha?
No, I was gonna say, why is this turning in on me all of a sudden? I was curious to see
How did I get into
your marital discord around the bargaining.
I'm thinking practical for people to have some way of identifying when they're actually bargaining versus testing out.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you how I think of bargaining, and I think it's a little bit, so when I was maybe more religious or more, I saw this a lot in my clients. Of course, I've worked with a lot of religious clients. I felt like bargaining was almost like bargaining with God. Like, please, you're looking at some like outer force, right, that can intervene into something horrific that you realize you really don't have any control over. I feel like bargaining is moving into this space where you start realizing you don't have control over what is happening. And so you're like looking to some outside force to intervene. Please, and a lot of times for a lot of religious people, that's praying to God, like, please intervene, like the classic, again, if somebody's died, it's like, please let this not be the case, or please let there be a miracle, or please, let there be something that could make this be different than the result it is. What I've learned about bargaining since then is that it really can look like a lot of the what if statements that we actually turn in on ourselves. A lot of people can spend a lot of time in what if territory. What if I would have done this? What if I would have done that? What if I would have dealt with that differently? It's kind of like a form of bargaining, especially when you don't necessarily no longer believe maybe in a higher power, or don't, use that in the same way as before. And so it can kind of turn into this very kind of shaming what if territory, where you're focused on how you could have done something differently in order to prevent the loss or change, and I think, John, you talk about this a little bit just in some of the slides when we present together, that it's kind of like the prairie, right? The prairie mouse, what's it called? The prairie person, the little prairie dog.
The gopher, the
gopher.
groundhog.
Yeah, groundhog. And then, they'll pop up and then it's like, oh, never mind. And I want to go back into where I was before. And so to avoid a lot of the pain and discomfort, right? So whether it's outward towards, God, please intervene, or whether it's kind of like, please, my past self, intervene, which you can't really have that, but we can get stuck in a lot of that what if thinking. Then either one is just realizing that you're not in control, and you hate that, but you're kind of giving your control away. In some ways, bargaining is still about giving your control away. I think that, what's the next one that you're talking about?
The testing out.
Testing is you are in control. That, to me, that I see that as the difference.
Love that. I really feel like that was important.
Love it. Yeah. How did I bargain? You want to know how I bargained?
Yeah. What did it look like for you?
So for me, it was exactly, I remembered back to BYU and the books I'd read, like A Thoughtful Faith and stuff by Leonard Arrington and Lowell Bennion. And I'm like, I think there have been people in the past who were Mormon, who were liberals, who still believed. And so for me, it was reading books by Lowell Bennion, Leonard Arrington, Eugene England, learning about progressive Mormonism, because it has its roots in the 70s and 80s, even though it's been popularized in the 2000s and beyond. And so then it was also learning about Judaism and Reform Judaism and the different forms of maturation in other people's faiths. And so then it was this, and I didn't have the benefit of Mormon Stories or Thoughtful Faith or podcasts or blogs, or even, the New Order Mormon website was the first website that I found that encouraged a middle way. And that was actually another important entree for me. Nowadays, people have never heard of the New Order Mormon website. 10 or 12 years ago, it was actually a really significant contributor to online Mormonism. I think at some point the website was completely taken down, which is a tragedy. But then it became embracing my buffet Mormonism, which is like, I'll pick and choose what works and what doesn't. I will nuance the temple recommend questions so that I can answer them appropriately. I'll accept the callings I want and not accept the ones I don't. I'll learn about other forms of spirituality to supplement the spirituality I'm not getting. I'll do a lot of distress tolerance at church so that I can deal with the difficulties of church.
Mm-hmm.
And I will find a lot of friends and people to talk to, and frankly, start a podcast as an outlet for all the angst and frustration and fear and social justice concerns that I have with keeping my name associated with the church. And that allowed me to prolong my bargaining for over a decade. But I was always conflicted. And so for me, the excommunication was sad, but it was a huge source of relief, because for me, trying to straddle that middle way, especially with certain policies in the church, the way women are treated, the way race and racial things are talked about, the LGBT issues, particularly the Prop 8 stuff and the November policies, and just the church's policies on LGBT people. There wasn't a way for me to remain an active member in good standing ultimately and pay tithing and serve the church, feeling like the church was harming people that I cared about. So for me, leaving was inevitable as long as those policies were in place. And so for me, those things ended up being bargaining, but not, testing in a more valid way.
Mm-hmm.
Did I answer your question?
You did. Mm-hmm.
How about you, Margie? How did it show up for you, do you think?
Probably similarly in behavior. I would probably say, adding Buddhism to my lessons, or saying that I would only but I don't see myself as a huge bargainer. I don't feel like, that's why I was kind of asking for clarification and some examples, is for me, with regard to sort of a faith transition, bargaining was not a huge player for me.
Yeah, you were kind of done. Once you were done, you were done. And you still went to church, but it was more...
The intention was familial support. It was to support our children.
It was just like, it's a good place to raise our kids. But as far as the truth claims or trying to reconcile, you just kind of moved on. And,
I think...
Natasha.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, I think for me, because for me, the testing part, the seeking realistic solutions, I'm still doing middle way Mormonism. And for me right now, that's working. At the same time, for me, I think the bargaining part, especially looking at it from this perspective of kind of like, what could I have done differently? It's almost a sign to me now of I'm heading down an unhealthy path, because a lot of times I'll let the old Mormon narrative voice step in as part of that bargaining. Like, well, really, if you just prayed harder, Natasha, if you just did the Mormon path better, you would get these answers kind of. And I know as soon as I have those kinds of thoughts or those doubts that I'm in that stage of bargaining for something that, first of all, I've already tested and that doesn't work for me. And secondly, it starts that shame cycle that actually is not helpful and actually propels me towards unhealthy stuff. And that, I think many people talk about that. It's kind of like, I don't believe that, but that voice sure still is there. Like I can still have some anxiety around that voice, or I can still have some. So I think in a sense that's bargaining, is that, well, if I just do these things, then the storyline will be true. And that has not been a healthy way for me to Mormon.
Yeah. Yep. Makes sense.
Shout out to Victoria, who's joined us from the UK. It's always great to have you, Victoria. Let's see. Debbie writes, I had something similar, only the admonition was to slow down, like let the truth unfold. I'm always in such a hurry. I wanted all the truth all at once. She says God had to slow me down, and I learned why going too fast was too painful and too overwhelming. Lonnie about the buffet Mormonism says, and then the Prophet Nelson just says no to buffet Mormonism. So that is how Lonnie's interpreting something President Nelson has said. I think I can relate to what Lonnie's saying, that sometimes it's not always easy to try and be a buffet Mormon, but I also I hear another voice inside me saying, make your religion your own. And I am aware of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of successfully practicing buffet Mormons. And so I want Lonnie to know that if it doesn't work for you, that's fine. But we all can claim our religious participation however we want to claim it. I think you would support that, right, Natasha?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is, of course, me projecting my own truth on everybody, but I just don't know how you can't but be a buffet Mormon, regardless of what President Nelson says. But I think her point is also, it's just that, you know, we consider these things and we are excited to adopt them, and then bam, you know, it's like the more literal kind of conservative voice, which is the strongest in the organized church, comes and like puts a damper on all these things that could potentially be helpful for us. It's like, nope, you're not allowed to do that. And so, yeah, it's hard when you're in a top-down religion like ours. There's not a lot of room for personal authority. There is in each individual person, but there just isn't a lot of room to really talk or be validated in that as the overall community.
Victoria gets a shout out for Buddhism. Lonnie also says loves the book you guys recommended, Secular Buddhism. It's a book and a podcast. Penny is being vulnerable. Penny says, I'm crying now. I'm going for a walk in the beautiful sunshine before I start working. Thank you for this great podcast. Oh, yeah. Glad you're liking it, Penny. Thank you so much for being vulnerable and for sharing. We're glad you're finding value. Okay, so we've been talking about bargaining. We've talked a little bit about testing. We're going to talk a bit more about testing, but let's hit a really important one really quick, which is depression. Depression is a stage of grief. It's also a clinical diagnosis. Natasha, you're closest to the clinical work of the three of us. Because you are, you're licensed right now and you actively do this work. Can you talk to us about depression as a clinical diagnosis and or versus depression as a stage of grief, and what we know about it and how we should think about it?
Well, depression is a hard word, I guess, because it can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. From a clinical perspective, you have to have so much criteria in place and for a certain amount of time before you'll get an official diagnosis of a clinical depression. And those symptoms are very easy to Google, so I'm not going to bore you with all that. But basically, loss of interest, loss of hope, loss of maybe even appetite or sexual desire, loss of, interest in the things that you usually find pleasurable, just kind of the want, right, of life.
Low energy.
Low energy. And so, we do have a diagnosis in the DSM-5 that I actually usually use a lot more for faith transition than the clinical depression, which is an adjustment disorder with depressive features, right? So that's, or anxiety features, or both. Because that gives some room for this idea that if you're going through an adjustment that is difficult, it kind of normalizes. It's still a diagnosis, so it still goes on your medical record, but it at least normalizes this idea that adjustments are difficult inherently, and that they might, result in some of these issues that fit the criteria for depression and anxiety. And it's not only until you maybe have those symptoms for longer than 6 months that you would probably move away from an adjustment disorder and maybe have the official diagnosis in of itself. But that basically what that's saying is that, in a sense, depression is the partner of acceptance, because depression is, in a sense, you realize, it's kind of like C-3PO. It's like, you're doomed. We're doomed. It's kind of like this. Okay, I've been in shock. I've been in denial. I got all angry. I tried to bargain my way out of it. And now it's like, now you're sitting in the muck of it, and you're realizing there really isn't, it's not going to go away. It's not going to change. And that can be extremely depressing. And yet I think it's helpful to frame that as the beginning part of acceptance, because in a sense, your system is having to really do that work of grief, right? That work of, ugh, it's just heavy. This is heavy. And when we deal with things that are heavy, yeah, we don't have a lot of fun with that. And it's not motivating. And I don't feel a lot of energy when I'm dealing with heavy. So that's a fairly normal response, even though it still kind of fits this clinical perspective. I think that, oftentimes, again, we don't want to feel depressed. So we'll oftentimes run away from that feeling. We'll take a pill or try to, exercise our way out, or, happy thought our way out of it, or sleep out of it. And I think it's one of those things that it's a balancing act of how long you just kind of let yourself feel those things that are appropriate for you to feel, and also not get into a rut where you're, it's going to be harder and harder for you to get out of a depressed state. So that's a hard balancing act for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a good time, especially if you feel like you've been dealing with that for longer than 6 months, to probably at least consider a mental health or primary caregiver type of assessment.
Which can be psychiatry, which is medication, if it's something more severe or biological, or if it's more mild to moderate and situational. It can be exercise, it can be talk therapy, psychologist, marriage and family therapist, licensed clinical social worker, lots of different ways. Behavioral activation is often the way out, but you're so demotivated, you don't feel like doing anything. And that's kind of where people get stuck. So sometimes just someone who can help you process it, talk through things, hold you accountable, help you set goals, help you kind of set milestones, that all can be really helpful. The only other thing I wanted to add is just that, just like we talked about with anger, how anger serves a real important purpose, so does depression. Mm-hmm. It slows you down. Mm-hmm. It makes you look at what you've experienced. It helps you, and that slowing down helps you learn mm-hmm. from the experience. It draws your attention, slows you down so you can learn, so you can not be fooled again or not be hurt again. And it can slow you down enough to then be able to eliminate all the other distractions in your life and allow you to create space for the rebuilding of the, basically of filling in all the holes that developed as a result of the faith crisis, whether it's spirituality or identity or community or family or morality or sense of meaning and purpose, or, beliefs or non-beliefs. Depression helps you sort of slow down, put a pause on or eliminate a bunch of extraneous things in your life, which allows you to have the space to look at and do the work to do rebuilding, learning and rebuilding.
Yeah.
So depression has a function mm-hmm. that's very important.
I love everything you're saying. And I think, in a culture that just really values, fast-paced productivity, instant results, we have a really, we have a difficult time seeing the function sometimes of depression, just because there's so much cultural disapproval for how it manifests. But I love everything you talked about with it slowing people down. And for me, it feels like too, I clearly come from a literature background, so I like, analogies, but I really love to think about it like for the longest time, we, amidst this grief process, we try to be so outward. There's this face we give to the world, and we hang on to that as long as we can. And I really see it as the depression that really changes and allows us to be vulnerable, to be sad, to really go into a state of, and on that level, it's kind of like we're given a flashlight. And if we're houses and the exterior is what we show to the world, and we have these approved of behaviors that are like the levels, we take that flashlight and we finally go into the basement and we start looking at what's there in the dark. And it is some of the toughest work to be had. And it's where so like some of the great gifts are, you know? And so I don't know, I really have just this soft place for this stage of grief, you know?
Oh,
Yeah,
so
I think,
brilliant.
yeah, I so appreciate all of that, because I think that, again, we tend to, a very common goal that comes into my therapy room is, I just want to be happy.
Mm.
And again, it's a word that we tend to use a lot in American culture. And I think that when we feel anger, when we feel grief, when we feel depression, we feel like there's something wrong with us, like we shouldn't be feeling these things. And although we don't want to get stuck in those things, to the point that now our life, our quality of life over years is dramatically impacted, there is something about seeing wisdom and seeing strength in us going through these stages, these negative feelings. I had somebody kind of put it in the language of that depression is a necessary step that begins to allow one to detach emotionally from the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so
yeah,
it is part of a process that we've, I think you used the word evolved to John earlier. This is part of the wiring of transitioning. So it's a balancing act, right? You have to kind of stay aware, like
mm-hmm.
how much of this is good for me to kind of muck and slow down and be patient with myself and understand I'm not just supposed to snap out of it and be okay. And at what point maybe do I need to get some more help to help me through a phase that seems to be ongoing, or it's too long, or it's causing too much distress in my life.
Yeah, I would say a great counterpart to the depression phase is that self-awareness to, be connected enough to yourself to know when you're going to need some external support and help, and even kind of processing movement. If you start kind of feeling overwhelmed or stuck at any time, that self-awareness to know that you deserve extra support. And, it can feel like a stage of overwhelm, where you can feel like it's all too much to hold. It's too much or you have a really hard time ever setting it down. And sometimes you kind of need breaks to do that,
And I don't know any depression plan from any type of therapist that doesn't include at some level connecting with a support system. Yeah. So in some ways, depression, I think, almost requires you to connect again in different ways with people than you were used to before. And in the context of faith transition, there's something really beautiful about that.
Yeah. Yeah. It changes who you are and how you connect with others.
And it can feel really crummy.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, it's kind of like that cocoon analogy too, where you're in the dark and you can feel really alone. And, and if you kind of work that right, it is also kind of part of your becoming, but it does feel like you can feel so alone, so insular, so separate, so like you have so much to hold on your own that you have to actually be proactive in creating spaces where there are people who show up for you and where you can get a break from holding it all by yourself.
There's something about grieving that we haven't quite touched on that I want to just throw out there. And I think it's part of the depression. Maybe it's also part of the acceptance conversation. But and I don't know how to articulate this, so I might need your help. But there's this idea when you're going through grieving where you're just basically saying, I'm sad, I miss this, or this hurt me, or life's never going to be the same again. What is that called? How would you guys describe that? Maybe it's captured in some of the phases we've talked about, but it's sort of like being able to express what this means to you, the sadness, the loss, the frustration. Where is that in this process? The ability to articulate and come to terms with what this loss means to you and how it's affected you. What is that? Where is that in this process? Do you guys know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I definitely see it as in this depression part. And that's why I call it the first step of acceptance. You know, it's kind of sitting with the new normal and how sad and awful that is. It's interesting, even from a clinical perspective, when people die, we don't give a clinical diagnosis of depression. We call it bereavement, because we expect people to struggle for a long time with the death of a loved one, especially an unexpected death, or, you know, kind of a non-timeline type death. Even expected deaths, you know, of a parent or whatever, can be extremely, extremely difficult. So I think that there even in the clinical language, like, we diagnose everybody with depression because that's how insurance covers you to get the therapy you need. But in reality, the DSM-5 calls this bereavement different than depression, because there's something natural about going through all of what you just said. I'm so sad. I'm so heartbroken. And of course, you know, depending on the context of all these people going through faith transitions, there can be exacerbating factors, like how supportive is your extended family? How supportive is your ward community? You know, if you're going through an excommunication like the Youngs, that's a very different approach than maybe somebody in a ward where, you know, we love you no matter what you believe and you're welcome anytime. I mean, I've heard of bishops and stake presidents saying those kinds of things, right? So context matters, and it's very complex. But I think that's all part of this depression stage, is just the sadness, the deep, profound sadness of it all. Mm-hmm. Which can also go into all those other things, like, what have I done? Why was I brainwashed, per se, right? Or all the opportunities I lost, or all the choices I made, all those identity crises parts of this, I think, fall very much squarely in both the anger and the depression phases, you know, as far as what were the implications for me, and having to really face those in the face is very difficult.
Judy makes the comment that it's a lot like death. It's bereavement. And there are a lot of questions that we'll get to next time on people who basically say it's a lot like losing a loved one. I'm sure there are ways that it's similar and ways that it's very different.
Yeah.
Well,
we've lost ourselves. We've lost a part of ourself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's an identity crisis at the core.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you lose so much. You lose, like I said, spirituality, sometimes a sense of meaning and purpose, family, friends, community, you know, your sense of, you know, your solace about the afterlife. Sometimes it can affect your relationships in very real ways. And so, you know, of course you're going to feel awful. And of course it's going to take time to rebuild. And so all that's going to be a part of the depression.
Yeah, but something that comes up a little bit for me in depression is the word reckoning. And I do feel like on a deep level, you are reckoning with reality. You're learning. And that's why I view acceptance as being a little bit further down the line as part of this process. Some of those questions do come up that Natasha was asking, of like, why me? Or, you know, what? And it is this sense of, you are really, really trying to integrate your experience into a reality you can live with, a reality that now is going to feel like truer to you, or more honoring to the life you want to live. But reckoning for me is a term that I think is kind of appropriate for at least one aspect of depression while you're down there in the basement with the flashlight, looking at all that is down there.
All right. We're running out of time for today. We've got about 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to, what we'll do is we'll cover these last two stages really quickly. And then what we're going to do is come back next week and integrate a lot of questions and comments from our listeners, because we've got at least another hour's worth of integration and questions. And this is such a really important topic. I think it's worth giving it lots of time. So we've already talked about testing. But we talked about testing versus bargaining. So let's talk about testing as seeking realistic solutions. There are all sorts of ways that that questioning and doubting and post-Mormons test realistic solutions. That can be anything from looking for new churches to replace the church you were in. It can be finding new sources of spirituality. For us, it was Eckhart Tolle and secular Buddhism. It can be finding communities on the internet through Mormon Spectrum or Waka or lots of the other groups to replace the community you had with the church with the new community. And some of those communities may work and some of them may not. Some people may find churches. Some people won't want to ever go to church again. Some people find a secular community like Oasis. There are lots of ways you can search for and test different communities. People can try on new identities, whether it's hiking or biking or fishing or camping or sewing or organic foods or essential oils or, crystals. Like, people try all sorts of different identities and things that they can pursue to forge new identities and support groups and friendships, etc. And then, of course, figuring out what you believe in God or the afterlife, or looking into secularism or atheism or agnosticism, or turning to an evangelical Christian church or whatever it is. Lots of different ways to test. And I kind of think of this as filling the holes. It's basically, and we had a whole episode about this, is rebuilding. You can't just focus on what you're mad about, what you're against, what you're angry about, what happened to you, kind of dwelling for too long in a victim posture. You have to rebuild and figure out what you're for, not just what you're against. And then you have to spend a lot of time, usually it's years, reconstructing a life that focuses on what you're for. And sometimes podcasts and Reddit and, post-Mormon groups can get you stuck in anger and stuck in venting, where you never, ever spend much time in the rebuilding. And that's just a really important part. And testing is the process of doing that rebuilding. What do you think of with testing, Natasha?
I think the language I like the most about testing is that, for me, it kind of brings up this imagery of a laboratory, and so there's no end result. There's no, we have to do it a certain way. We can try things out. We can see if it works or feeds us, or if we need to shift again. And I really like the fluidity and the openness and the possibility of just the word testing. Whereas I think we come from a background where it's all already preordained and preset, and you're supposed to fit into this box. Now there's 20 different boxes, and you get to open them up and test them out and see if the product works for you or not. And if it doesn't, you can return it. And if it does, you can add it to your toolbox or whatever. And this is an idea I really work with a lot of clients around, is exploratory timeframes. We don't have to make any final decisions today. Why don't you try something out for the next 3 weeks? Come back. Let's talk about what that was like for you. Take some introspection time during that time. I just really like this permission almost, and this idea of exploration that the word testing just gives us, just by being the word itself.
Debbie gives a shout out for secular Buddhism. Victoria gives a shout out for Eckhart Tolle. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to talk about just kind of what it means to me a little bit. I love it too, Natasha, the idea, just the terminology, testing out. And one thing I like to think of testing as being is sort of this, now you have this emerging new self, right? So you went into the basement, and what did you find? And you went into the dark, and you spent time there. And it is this act of discovery and almost curiosity at, who am I now? What do I love? What feels good? It's almost like an update. You're allowing yourself time to get to know yourself again with this new knowledge, or with these new insights, or, with the things that you've kind of learned. And so I love it as kind of an information gathering, less than some type of pressureful, gotta figure it out, but more of a curiosity, more of a trying to get to know yourself in this new place.
Yeah, and I think as Mormons, we can be uncomfortable with that because we don't really know how to do that. We want to almost sometimes, trade one sure product for the next sure product. And so I see a lot of people kind of uncomfortable with the ambiguity of not knowing or not having everything figured out or not knowing what to tell their kids sometimes. And I think there's a lot of beautiful space in the I don't know that we were never really taught to consider, as in our Mormon upbringing.
I so agree, where we're so end oriented, and testing is it's equally about process. That's what I'd say. And it's just one of my favorite places to be with my clients, is in kind of testing and information gathering for themselves. This is where it gets really, really good. It starts rebuilding your identity. It starts rebuilding a life that actually now feels like you.
Yeah, when we've talked about, when Jesus talks about being born again, when we've talked about the faith crisis being a gift, I think that's what we mean by the faith crisis being a gift. And when Richard Rohr talks about this, he talks about the first half of your life being building up a vessel that can contain, a full, rich life. And that's your education, your ego, your sense of, individuality, your personality, your resources around you. Richard Rohr talks about that being the first half of your life. And then the second half of your life is filling the vessel that you created in the first half of your life. It's a really beautiful way to think about it. And it's this testing that's another way of describing what Richard Rohr talks about in his book, Falling Upward, which I strongly recommend you guys check out. He gives you a framework for looking at this faith crisis as something that has always been what's supposed to happen, and that is almost a universal experience. At some point, you're going to lose your faith in the simplified system that was handed to you, but this is a great opportunity. Once you've built a life into adulthood and have resources, then you can spend your time creating the exact life you want. And that's where this testing becomes an opportunity for growth and fulfillment and meaning. And that's why we're not just being glib when we created a logo for the gift of the faith crisis that's got a sunshine and a sprouting plant. It's because we really believe that this is not just this curse and this bad thing that happened, but it's a phenomenal opportunity. You've been given the gift of the rest of your life. And so what are you going to do with it? Are you going to squander it? Or are you going to do amazing, fun, meaningful things? And that's the question, that's the opportunity. And so that's what we're talking about here. And so I think it's exciting and it's powerful and it's meaningful. We've got several comments. We'll just blow through them really quickly because we kind of have to run. Debbie writes, thank you for talking about breaking through victimhood and getting stuck in venting in post-Mormon groups. I'm so happy that was said. Yes, Debbie, we're willing to acknowledge that here. She also really loves the testing concept we're exploring in patience. Natasha, do you have Victoria's comment in front of you?
Yeah, I felt I lost a lot of myself when I joined the church. And so when I left, there was some excitement to remember who I am again. And to, and Debbie says, so interesting, I was born into the church, but I can so relate. So whether you joined and are going back to something that you once remember, or whether you were always there, but you're still kind of reclaiming this aspect of who am I, that's a wonderful process, I think, of this whole kind of identity work that we're all immersed in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Victoria wrote something a little bit above, Natasha. Oh, Margie, do you want to read this above?
For a long time, I needed to be on my own, and that helped me. I needed to figure out who I am and what I want on my own. It might not work for everyone, but it did for me. Lots of yoga, reading, meditation, gardening, painting, and all kinds of things that made me feel good and invited stillness. I so relate, Victoria. Really, even with the things that worked for you to kind of invite stillness. Really beautiful.
Kristen writes, and yes, Victoria, you illustrate just the joy. It's like, try cooking, try yoga, try hiking, try skydiving, try, the world is your oyster. Try travel, try movies,
And it's all designed, it's like whatever brings you back to yourself and whatever brings you like a connection to sort of being alive, to being in the world,
And Natasha is a sex therapist. How about, Natasha, can you vouch that some people have had a sexual awakening where they've discovered new pleasure and joy that they never thought possible? Can you validate that?
Yeah, well, let's do a whole thing on that one, because I think a faith transition, it just eventually will, if not be propelled by sensuality and sexuality. I mean, there's just no way those things can be separate.
Kristen writes, there's a need to have a replacement of beliefs as soon as possible. I wanted security and certainty in my life again. I realized over time the beauty and uncertainty and discovery. And that's profound, Kristen.
Very common.
And I, Noah Rasheta in secular Buddhism is going to reflect that as well, that there's this real power and reality in just not knowing. And you can actually, believe it or not, we found so much comfort in saying we knew everything that it becomes disorienting to not know anything. But you can reach a point, and Buddhism helps, where actually you're like, whoa, it's a huge relief and a comfort to just embrace the fact that you don't know anything and that life's a mystery, and that, you just be in the moment, because you can't spend your time, you don't want to be fooled again, having some other leader come up to you and tell you that they know the truth, and you start following that only to discover that that's not true either. And instead of always pursuing some absolute truth, you just relax into the present moment. And while you give up certainty, what you get is just this beautiful focus on what's right in front of you, because really that's the only thing you know for sure, is like, I'm here, I'm present today, I have today. And instead of worrying about the past or obsessing about the future, I'm just going to have joy today. And that becomes a really powerful trade that you make.
Well, and I think what we're talking about, just to bring about the stages, what we're really talking about now is we've kind of moved on from testing, and we're talking about acceptance, the acceptance stage of grief, which is, that sense of really understanding that you're not going back, you're not in denial anymore, you're not ignoring the loss, you've done some testing, and now you're in a space of like, oh, yeah, I'm going to have to get comfortable with ambiguity, or I'm going to practice that, and we're really starting to talk about this seventh step in a lot of these comments.
Yeah. And so we do end with acceptance. And that's just, I don't know, if you guys remember, do you guys remember what the very first episode of The Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis was in the modern iteration? Do you guys remember what it was?
Wasn't it like the top 10 things or something?
No, well, yeah,
gratitude?
That was in the old version. It was sort of making peace.
Gratitude.
Making peace.
Oh, yeah, making peace with them. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's also part of what acceptance is. It's not just embracing everything in terms of the new life you're going to create. There's a real health in embracing the past.
Yeah.
And there's a really good TED Talk that Anthony Miller recommended that we all listen to. I'm going to share it in the comments. But it's about a woman whose husband died. And she realized that it was fallacious for her to think that she was ever going to move beyond her deceased husband. She wasn't going to get over her ex-husband. What she found is that she can move in a new direction, bringing her ex-husband with her, because there's no way that she was ever going to escape him. He was always going to be a part of her life. He was always going to be in the child that they had together. He was always going to be in her memories, in her past. And in many ways, he would, her relationship with him would shape her future, even though she got remarried and built a whole new life with a new partner. This idea of getting over Mormonism, for many people, ends up being just kind of fallacious. You really can't ever un-Mormon yourself in some ways, and you're never going to really sort of, even if you leave the church and resign and move to New Zealand, in some way, Mormonism will always be a part of what shaped you and who you are, for better and for worse. And so I think part of the acceptance narrative isn't just embracing where you are, but it's also making peace with where you've come from and acknowledging the good and the bad, and just saying, just like you might wish for a partner you've divorced if you end up leaving the church, instead of being angry and furious and framing that whole marriage as a huge mistake if it ended, you just say, hey, I love you. We shared these moments together. We had this time together. I bless you, and now let's move in different directions, either together or separate. Together if you stay in the church, separate if you leave it. But just approaching it with peace and grace and acceptance and integration.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Go ahead.
No, don't. Okay. Um, yeah, I see it as well as this piece of where you're no longer putting energy into fighting reality. You're not fighting your story. You're not fighting. You've reframed where you could reframe and thought about things differently. And now you are this integrated being. But it is in a way that you've been very conscious and intentional about creating. And so, I don't know, that integration part, I really, really love, where you've kind of gathered up your experiences or things that have happened to you, and you know, have now decided what they'll mean to you. You've decided now, you know, moving forward, what you want your life to be about. That to me is sort of acceptance. It's a very emboldened place. It's a very peaceful place. It's an accepting place, but it's, you know, about not fighting reality.
Anything you want to add about acceptance, Natasha?
Well, I think that I really like the word integration. I don't like the words that we use oftentimes in our culture about recovering, healing from, moving on, because, you know, even like in the work I do around sexual trauma, it kind of like, I think those words like kind of think that you're going to somehow, you know, like you're saying, leave it behind and you're never going to look back. It's never going to affect you again. And I think all things in life affect us, you know, forever in many different ways, shapes, and forms. And so this integration aspect is really a much more realistic way. And so that acceptance also in a way like makes room for all the other stages of grief, because you will probably revisit stages of grief. And if you're really kind of in an acceptance state, you'll understand that and not be harsh with yourself or see yourself as somehow having failed in the healing process because you're revisiting a stage of grief, right? And so it's kind of this nice kind of play on words that you can kind of almost wrap all of those into an acceptance type of space of moving forward in ways that are integrative, not that we're going to forget, or that those things aren't going to, like I said, sting at times or come back and ruminate or come back, or, you know, if something's happening in the news or in your family or even developmentally, like all of a sudden your child is going through a developmental phase that you went through at a certain time in your faith transition. And so we're going to remember, we're going to have body memories, we're going to have moments. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that we have failed in this process.
So important.
Yeah.
We have so much more to discuss. We're getting great comments from our listeners. Courtney reminds us of the story of the two arrows. The first arrow meaning pain, which is unavoidable in life. The second is suffering, which is all the discomfort and extra pain we add to our lives by not accepting the first arrow. That comes from Noah Rasheta and the secular Buddhism stuff. Please check out Secular Buddhism. You'll love it. Thanks for the reminder, Courtney. Roger, my dear friend Roger Hendricks, he writes, I've had bouts of depression during my lifetime. I'm surprised that depression did not visit me in my journey through Mormonism. I feel I've evolved. I've not lost a testimony. I've evolved. I am experimenting with new communities. Open Stories Foundation is my internet community. It's been comforting for me. Roger, thank you for sharing that. We're so glad you're a part of our community. And thanks for your good spiritedness about my naming your podcast on Mormon Stories in a way that you weren't totally comfortable. I was trying to get people to listen to it, but it didn't do you justice. And so check out Roger Hendricks' 10.5-hour interview on Mormon Stories podcast. It's a brilliant interview, one of the most important ones we've ever done. Thanks, Roger, for sharing. KJC says, do you want to read that, Margie?
Sure. After a year of cancer treatment, I really learned that living in the moment was the optimum way to live. It's not easy to remember to do that, as living in the past and future became a bad habit. But I seem to still be stuck in being so angry at the church for giving me all the answers, only to find out they were not. Need to watch this from the beginning. I'd like some of this piece you're speaking of.
We welcome you, KJC, to listen from the beginning, and we're going to do some more next week, so we'll have a lot more. This is a really important episode. Natasha, can you see Emily's comment there at the end?
Yes, I was just thinking this morning that I wish I could go through Mormon dialysis and just filter all of the Mormon thoughts, feelings, and history that are part of me. I love the idea of integration instead. I can't pull out and replace those parts of myself. I just need to accept them. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Emily. And with that, we need to wrap up today. But we have so many questions and comments and stories from our listeners that we're going to have a part, 3 or 4 of this episode that we continue next week. Same bat time, same bat channel, as we said growing up. But I just want to thank Margie. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
And Natasha, thank you for being with us today.
We both thank you.
Thank you both for being with me. I always love these discussions. I always feel like, when you said the comment that we don't want to trade one prophet for another, I really hope that people understand that's not our intent here either, right? And so I learned from everybody's comments and from both of you as much as I hope to share some experiences that I hope that are helpful as well. So I really, really just benefit from this whole process. So thank you for including me on a regular basis.
Yeah, and thanks to all our listeners. We've had so many phenomenal comments, in the live feed. If you guys just want some real wisdom, go to the feed and see just all the many deep and interesting stories and perspectives that have been shared. There have been over 97 comments on today's episode. That's a lot of comments. And we really appreciate that. Let's see. Yeah, 205 total comments. Lots of real wisdom there. Some of it we weren't able to get to. So please check out these comments. Listeners and viewers, thank you so much for being a part of this. You made this presentation better. And thank you for everyone who shares this, who promotes this, who likes our page, who gives us positive reviews, who shares it on their wall. All the ways that this site gets promoted, this podcast gets promoted. We want to thank everyone for doing that. Please share this with a loved one if you think it would be useful. Thanks to all our donors again that make this possible. If you want to support us, please go to MormonFaithCrisis.com and donate. And we just want to promise you that your donations will go to keep this podcast alive. And now that we're affiliating with the Open Stories Foundation, your donations will also go to keeping the Open Stories Foundation alive, and will also be tax deductible. So for all those reasons, thanks for the support. Please continue supporting us. We love you guys.
We appreciate you. Thank you.
And we'll see you guys soon next week for the continuation of this topic on the essential role of grief in a Mormon faith crisis. Thanks, Natasha.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
We'll see you soon.